Okay, now will you share with us what you do with your clients and how that evolved?
Yeah. A lot of therapy is really just kind of connecting. I mean, there's all these external elements, don't get me wrong, but they at some point facilitate defense mechanisms that we create at a very early age. And I always joke that there's like the emotional version of, I want to say, Newton's second law: objects in motion stay in motion until met with friction. Well, beliefs work that way too. Until someone or something happens where it really, really shows us like, hey, that's not accurate, we carry that forward. And if we don't recognize that, we'll think we're stupid all the way to adulthood because we felt stupid as a child, even though we've shown ourselves our intelligence multiple ways since. But no one was like, you're smart or something like that, to really create enough friction for it to be like, am I? Like, I remember using the word clever my whole life, but it not smart, because with my ADHD, I was put in a room one class, per week to like help me catch up on my homework and have them explain it to me slower and all that kind of stuff to help with my comprehension. And kids would call it like the stupid room and things like that. So that locked in. And until I really recognized, well, there's 7 types of intelligences and blah, 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 and school doesn't reflect right brain learning, yada, yada, yada. So that's what created the friction for me. So there eventually creates an inner conflict. And that's really, really highlighted in Tritype, right? So there's like, for example, like when 9 and 3 are in the same Tritype, there's that desire to be a go-getter, knock things off the list, be moving, doing, be like a mover shaker. But then the 9 who wants to relax and sit and watch, Netflix and chill, engage in self-care, and really just, go with the flow and not be the thing that's facilitating. And that's an inner conflict. When you're working hard, you want to be relaxing, but when you're relaxing, there's something you should be doing at that moment. So there's this like inner conflict that can be created in Tritype, and it gets magnified further if all 3 are not the same place, or 2 versus 1, that kind of vibe. At the same time, it's a really good way to highlight, and this might sound hokey, but I'm not really big on like strength, weakness, because in my opinion, the same thing is a strength if you use it here, but if you use it over there, it's not. It depends who you're talking to, the situation you're using it in, the frequency that you use it, the intensity that you've used it. There's too many variables to just label it just as this is always, because if it's always a strength, it should work all the time with everybody, which is not the case. Sometimes I'm considered confident and straightforward. Other times I'm obnoxious and like to hear the sound of my voice. Depends who I'm talking to and what the setting is. So recognizing that like, oh, the thing that all 3 numbers have in common, that's probably what you're going to think is your strength, where you're going to feel most comfortable when it's something that you lean towards. But there's also something that all 3 numbers are like, I'm good. Nope. No, thank you. I don't need that over here. And that's the thing that you triple avoid. And then when 2 out of 3 feel one thing, then there's an inner conflict. When all 3 feel differently, that's a different kind of conflict. So I really use that to be like, is this the message you send yourself because of the numbers doing this, that, and the other? And that really helps people go, oh, other people have this conflict. I'm like, well, yeah, it's very normal. And it really allows to normalize. It really allows me to normalize, which I think is the most healing part of therapy. It's like, oh, cool, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that does this. Anything you want to add to that, Mom?
Yeah, you're so right. I want to say a few things about what he said, because there are known defense strategies that we would recognize in therapy. And there are 9 distinct defense strategies, but we really use the 3, the one from each center. And that means when we're in an emotional situation, we're going to use the resources, positively or negatively, of our heart type. When we're in a situation where we need to know something, we're going to use our head type, our mental type. And when we have to make a decision about doing something or not doing something, and it's visceral, we're going to use our gut type. Now, when I said this 30 years ago, people were like, oh, wait, no, that can't be right. Your type would determine that. But if you know anything about the Enneagram, the lines of connection do not enable all 9 types to access all 3 centers. And this is when I knew that my clients were onto something. because 2 and 4 have no connection to the head center, yet they have a head type, and 5 and 7 have no line of connection to their heart center. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. The Enneagram that we use is the Enneagram of motion, which is thought to be creation plus divinity and the dynamic movement within the universe. So I know that's why Achazo chose that system, and I'm imagining that's what Gurdjieff thought as well. But I just want to clarify, any 9-pointed system, and there's a great one early on from a scholar that recognized that every type is related to every other type. And that's a whole nother thing to go into the history. But I see how every type relates to every other type, positively and negatively. So if you're given a test to choose between 2 opposites, then you're going to choose the one you identify with. But when there are 2 very close, you're going to perhaps have more of a struggle. That's why I work in patterns of 3 with the testing instrument. And I have you rank over and over and over again. I gave you 3 versions of every type, and you determined your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice of each type. And then I tested you in a number of ways accordingly. The union of the 3 defense strategies is still governed by your instinctual type. I wanted so much for it to be that you had, like, for example, I would be sexual 8, and I'd be self-pres 7, and social 4. I thought that would be elegant. That's probably my 4 in the Tritype. That would be fluid, easy. Everyone could stack their 3 types, stack their 3 instincts, and then come up with that pattern. And it is true at an advanced level. But what happened instead is the instinct is so strong that it dominates the system and is the governing factor. And this was absolutely the opposite of what was thought at the beginning of the dissemination of the Enneagram. It was believed that your type governed it. Now, I have to distinguish between what Achazo said and what Naranjo said. Achazo saw the types, and actually it's a very elegant system where he saw the types as instinctual triads. And I don't want to confuse you, but I want to make the distinction that the subtypes were Naranjo's interpretation of the lowest functioning, more primitive element of your ego type. So he added the subtypes as variations within type. And he began in 1972 noticing these tells, the ways he could begin to just recognize a type. So it's important to know how things began, and I'd love to tell you all about that. But in this class, we're going to go now into Spencer's shortcut as to how he languages this with the clients. But I want to say one last thing, and that is he mentioned something really important, that it could be 3 having a similar view and it's harder, but we always have 1 that's really dominant and the 2 to a lesser degree, and they make decisions pretty easily. But people who have 2 types really close can go back and forth and back and forth. And more importantly, if something needs to be decided, like in my case of an emotional nature, my 4 is so small compared to my 8 and 7 that all I know is I want to give meaning to this suffering. I don't want to stay in the suffering any more than Spencer does. And I want to not necessarily go into denial over although it worked quite well. It didn't work in the long run because I was repeating patterns and not knowing how I was coming across to others. I go, what? Wait, you have a problem with that? I'm just giving you the truth. I can't show you any greater respect. That's what I tell my high school friends or my elementary school friends. And they go, what? Not everybody wants to know the truth. And I said, I want to know the truth. And eights do. We don't want to have things we don't know. Tell us the worst, then we'll deal with it. But other types are like, what? They're waiting for the other shoe to fall. Yeah, I don't have that. I'm going to give you both shoes right up front. The velocity of those giving you those shoes may vary, but there's no hidden agenda or something that's coming later. But if you have 6 in a tritype, then you're looking for that. Now, last but not least is that when Spencer was talking earlier, he really hit upon what you may know as Hornevian types. Now, what's interesting about Karen Horney, and she wrote a book, Our Inner Conflicts, is she was a 2 that was just incredible at recognizing these 3 distinct types of defense strategies as overall defense strategies. And we now call them the Hornevian types. And they were actually first developed by Kathy Hurley and Ted Dobson, who later became Theodore Donson. If you see both names, one's not a typo, he changed his name. And then later developed by Don Riso and Russ Hudson. So it's so complementary. And Claudio Naranjo loved the work of Karen Horney. And as a psychiatrist that was also doing psychoanalytical work and working with the most progressive views in the 60s, he liked all those systems. So that's another story. But Spencer, you just hit on things that are really, really important. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Carry on.
So the shortcut to explaining tritype, that's what you're referring to?
Yeah, how you explain it to your clients beyond what you shared.
Yeah. I like to use colors. So a lot of times people don't understand. It's like, okay, so I have like the 8, the 4, the 6. Sometimes it's these 3 numbers and they see them as individuals. And then they're like, okay, well, I don't really align with this part of the 8. I don't align with this part of the 4. So the way to think of it is I want you to think that you've got 3 different colors and one of them takes up like half of the paint palette, right? And then another one takes up like a third, and then the other one takes up a sixth. And you mix those all together. It's going to create its own color. But it's going to be mostly the first color. Then you're going to second most notice the second color. And then thirdly, the third color. Now you can change the ratios. It'll be the same color, but maybe you'll think it has more of a tint to this, more of a tint to that, which is why a different order of a tritype will actually connect with a different order of the same tritype, as opposed to what a lot of people think is like 2 8s. They'll get each other even if they have 7, 6, and 2 and 3. It's like, no, actually, they'll get each other on the 8 level, but they won't get the other 2 parts. So understanding it as its own type, it's how they all come together. And then what you see. And granted, when my 4 comes out, when my 6 comes out, you will recognize the 4 and the 6. But it's really me as an 8 putting on a 4 costume, putting on a 6 costume. I'm still going to approach it 8-like, because that is my primary number. That is what all the numbers are going to go through before they leave my mouth and communicate. So if I'm afraid and my 6 is really activating, I'm probably going to use anger and aggression to express that, because I'm trying to take control and I'm trying to be like, this is what needs to be done and blah, blah, blah. And people will misunderstand. I'm actually not angry. I'm frustrated that the thing I'm stressed out about isn't happening like how it needs to be happening so I can protect and take care of blah, 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 blah. And I'm not trying to deal with like all this other stuff that you're trying to, no, I have a thing in my head. So I'm coming at it very directly and very specifically, but I'm being motivated, not necessarily by my 8. I'm just communicating it that way. But there's a lower number that's speaking, right? And so it's understanding that kind of breakdown. So I use colors to explain that because sometimes people get lost. A lot of times when I'm working with my clients, they're like, yeah, but I'm a this. So blah, blah, blah. And I'll be like, well, yeah, but you also have these 2 other numbers that balance out this, magnify that, cancel out this because they're just too clashy about that. And when you bring all of that together, it explains so much more. Because there's going to be individual parts of the numbers where you're like, oh, I don't identify with that. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's a reason for that. You got this other number and it's also higher up on the totem pole. So that kind of gets hidden. Like if you really focus, you can find it, but it's not going to be as clear to you because one, maybe 2 other numbers are above that with some trait that kind of hides that or doesn't prioritize that. So it's really important to kind of see the whole picture for what it is. Is there anything you'd want to add to that?
That is great. And this hierarchy is always governed by your dominant type because they're in a stacking order. So they kind of move together. But as I said a moment ago, if the 8 has gotten emotional, their heart type is just kind of joining in. If they're in thinking process and they're emotional and feeling the need to be protective or assert, they're going to do so like their head type. And in Spencer's case, as a 6, it's very important because when 8 is in the tritype with a 6, the 6 becomes counterphobic. It's the most important thing I would hope that I can impart is that the counterphobic 6 is reactive, but they're trying to deal with fear. And some 6s feel the fear and move away from a perceived hazard or problem. And that would be more phobic. And other 6s, they can't tolerate the anxiety and they go right into it. And they're more counterphobic. But there's everything in between. But if you're a 6 with 8, you may think you're an 8, and everyone else might as well. If you're an 8 with 6, you're just going to need to get things mentally on par with everything else, because otherwise something could go wrong. And the 8's looking at the big picture of what could go wrong, recognizing it and then dealing with it. But the 6 says, wait, but this could go wrong too. And the 4's saying, I need to give meaning to my suffering. So that's so helpful, Spencer.